You have 24 hours to demolish that structure or we'll have the sheriff haul you out in chains." Those words weren't spoken in a courtroom, not whispered in some back-alley power deal. They were screamed at me, right in the middle of my own land, with the echo bouncing off pine-covered ridges like some twisted sermon. The woman behind the threat was no stranger. Her name was Victoria Ashworth, the self-crowned queen of Pine Valley's Homeowners Association. She didn't come alone. SUVs lined the gravel road like an invasion force, engines ticking in the cool mountain air, while neighbors I'd never even met stared at me as though I were a criminal trespasser on my own soil. It had only been 3 days. 3 days since I started building the first real thing in my life that wasn't collapsing. A log cabin, nothing extravagant, just timber, sweat, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, my daughter Emma could look at me and see something other than a man broken by divorce and debt. Yet here was Victoria, storming onto my inherited land as if she'd purchased the mountain itself, her heels clicking against stone like gunshots. In her hand, a leather portfolio stuffed with legal threats that smelled of ink, intimidation, and perfume strong enough to choke out the scent of pine sap. She called me an individual, like my name didn't matter. Like men like me were just obstacles to be moved aside by the powerful. She waved papers in my face, claiming my uncle had signed covenants binding me to rules he couldn't possibly have agreed to because he was already 6 feet underground when they were written. Her eyes were sharp, but her smile was sharper, the kind of smile that cuts you without leaving blood. And then she said it, the line that burned through my chest like ice. "This isn't the type of neighborhood where people in your situation thrive. Think about your daughter, would, and want her to be embarrassed. That wasn't regulation. That wasn't governance. That was a threat against me, against Emma." As her convoy disappeared down the road, Uncle Silas's last words came back to me. "Don't let anyone push you around." I stood staring at the cease-and-desist order in my calloused hands. They thought I was powerless. They thought they could drown me in fines and humiliation. What they didn't know was that the lake they wanted to claim, the docks they thought they controlled, those belonged to me. And the moment they found out, their empire would crack like thin ice under heavy boots. The truth about my land didn't come to me all at once. It revealed itself like a shadow in the corner of a room, something you don't notice until it's already watching you. That night, after Victoria's ultimatum, I couldn't sleep. The cabin frame stood half-finished under the silver wash of moonlight, a skeleton of my future, trembling against the weight of her threats. I sat at the old workshop table my Uncle Silas had left behind, its surface scarred by years of use, and dug through the files he'd hidden in rusted drawers. Among the yellowed deeds, oil-stained survey maps, and handwritten notes, I found something that made my hands freeze. It wasn't just the 5 acres I had inherited. Silas had quietly acquired water rights stretching across the valley, rights that legally included the lake itself and, by extension, every dock nailed into its shoreline. My stomach turned cold. The same people threatening me, fining me, humiliating me, every one of them had been unknowingly paying taxes to maintain docks they didn't own. The entire HOA was squatting on my property. But power isn't just about what you hold, it's about what you reveal and when. If I moved too quickly, they'd bury me in false claims, lawsuits, and county favors bought with bribes. I needed patience and patience was something Silas had always preached. The mountain doesn't move for storms, he once told me. It waits, and the storm destroys itself. The next morning, Victoria returned with reinforcements. This time it wasn't just SUVs, it was a lawyer who looked like he'd lost an argument with both fashion and sobriety. He mumbled about retroactive violation penalties, about $15,000 in fines, about how my ownership could be voided because I hadn't received HOA disclosure documents. The absurdity nearly made me laugh. How could a dead man, my uncle, sign contracts written after his death? How could land I legally inherited suddenly be bound by covenants drawn up months later? Yet standing there, with Victoria's perfume cutting the air and her lawyer's sweat dripping onto paperwork, I understood their game. They didn't expect me to fight. They expected me to fold under intimidation, to sell my land cheap, to disappear. But as I watched Victoria's eyes glint with arrogance, I realized something deeper. This wasn't just a battle over land. This was war over identity. And if she wanted a fight, she had chosen the wrong man to corner. I knew if I faced them unarmed, they would crush me, not with fists, not with bullets, but with paper, fines, citations, summonses, the quiet weapons of bureaucrats and opportunists. So I did what any man backed into a corner must do. I went hunting for truth. The county courthouse smelled of mildew and fluorescent exhaustion, but it held the records I needed. Betty, the clerk with decades in her eyes, slid thick ledgers across the counter. She lowered her voice like we were sharing state secrets. "You're not the first they've gone after," she whispered. "But this," she tapped the maps spread before us, "this feels targeted." And targeted it was. The Pine Valley HOA had been formed exactly 6 months ago, 2 months after Silas was buried. Their jurisdiction lines, neat as a sniper's scope, encircled my land like a bullseye. 12 houses, all tied by blood or business to Victoria's family. I stared at the lines, fury tightening my chest. This wasn't community oversight. This was a cartel with manicures. But the deeper I dug, the uglier it became. HOA filings showed special assessments bleeding residents dry, thousands of dollars every month, with no roads built, no amenities added, no playgrounds, no parks. The money vanished into consulting fees and legal research, names of companies that didn't exist. It wasn't mismanagement, it was theft, organized, deliberate theft wrapped in the language of governance. I thought of my daughter Emma, of the cabin I was building for her, of the way Victoria's eyes had gleamed when she mentioned her name. That wasn't just a casual threat. She had researched me. She knew the cracks in my life. She was pressing her heels into them, grinding until they shattered. For the first time in years, I felt the dangerous clarity of anger, the kind that strips away hesitation and leaves only resolve. As I left the courthouse, mountain air rushed into my lungs, clean and sharp. I realized then that I wasn't fighting for land or money or pride. I was fighting for the story my daughter would inherit about her father. Was he the man who let wolves strip him bare? Or the man who stared into their teeth and refused to kneel? Victoria believed she was untouchable. But storms don't ask mountains for permission. They come. And when they come, they leave nothing the same. 2 nights later, I discovered what desperation smells like. It wasn't just diesel fumes from my overturned generator or the acrid sting of gasoline soaking into pine needles. It was the stench of fear trying to disguise itself as power. My construction site looked like a war zone, lumber scattered like bones, roofing nails glittering across the driveway, my truck resting on 4 punctured tires. Someone wanted me to understand this wasn't a dispute anymore. It was war. Neighbors pretended not to see. Some waved nervously from their porches. Others turned away as if eye contact itself might invite punishment. That told me everything. Victoria ruled not by respect but by fear. She had cowed an entire valley into silence. And silence, I knew, is the lifeblood of corruption. But fear is fragile when exposed to light. The cameras I'd installed caught everything. Shadows moving at midnight, a pickup truck creeping without headlights, a figure in a hoodie pouring accelerant near my lumber. When he turned his head, the lens froze him in unforgiving clarity. Tommy Ashworth, Victoria's son. Her blood, her heir, caught red-handed committing felony arson on federal time-stamped footage. The next morning, I walked into the sheriff's office with a flash drive that could shatter an empire. The deputies studied the video with tight jaws. They knew the Ashworth name. They knew what it meant to their careers. Still, evidence speaks louder than legacy. Tommy was in handcuffs before sunset, and Victoria's porcelain mask cracked. But victories like that don't come clean. That night, my phone buzzed with venom. Anonymous numbers, blocked callers, messages dripping with threats. "You think this ends with him?" We know where your daughter goes to school. Stop before someone gets hurt." Each word was a knife twisting deeper. For the first time, I wondered if they might turn their malice toward Emma. I sat in Silas's workshop, surrounded by his tools and his ghost, and felt the weight of lineage pressing down. He had vanished into these mountains decades ago, muttering about land having secrets. Maybe this was what he meant. Maybe the true inheritance wasn't just acres and water rights. It was the battle itself, the demand that someone stand unflinching when power turned rotten. Victoria thought she could break me with threats, with fines, with fear. But fear only works when it isn't shared, and I was about to make the whole world see exactly who she really was. The battle stopped being about paperwork the swooshji. The moment Victoria weaponized the crowd. She didn't just fight me in courtrooms or behind county doors. She dragged me onto the digital gallows. A new Facebook group appeared overnight, Pine Valley Community Safety. At first glance, it looked like a neighborhood forum. But the front page was a shrine to paranoia, and the villain was me. There was my photo, an old picture lifted from a union newsletter, cropped to make me look menacing, captioned with words like transient, dangerous, predator. The comments section was a frenzy of fear. Get this man out before something happens to our kids. The sheriff needs to act now. Who let him move here? Strangers I'd never spoken to were constructing a mythology where I was the monster under their children's beds. Emma called me that night, her voice shaking. "Dad, people at school are sharing stuff about you. They're saying you're dangerous." I could hear the hurt in her words, the kind of wound that bleeds inside where no one can see. I told her the truth, that it was all lies, a smear campaign. But lies, when dressed in fear, travel faster than truth ever can. Still, arrogance has a way of exposing itself. In her eagerness to prove the HOA had the funds to keep fighting me, Victoria posted their financial summaries on the group page. Maybe she thought numbers would intimidate people. Instead, they told a different story. Hundreds of thousands of dollars collected in special assessments from just 12 families. Over $70,000 per household in 6 months. For what? No parks, no playgrounds, no roads. Just empty ledgers fattened by consulting fees with no explanation. I printed every page, every post, every figure. When I showed them to Sarah, my attorney, she nearly spilled her coffee. "She just gave you federal evidence," she said. "Fraud this blatant doesn't stay local. It climbs ladders, to state investigators, to IRS agents, to prosecutors who salivate over organized embezzlement." But I wasn't naive. A wounded animal is most dangerous when cornered, and Victoria was bleeding arrogance all over the valley. She wouldn't retreat, she'd escalate, and every step deeper into corruption would reveal more of who she really was. For me, the fight had stopped being about property lines. It had become about exposure, not just proving my innocence, but dragging her empire into the light where shadows can't survive. Corruption has a taste. It's metallic, bitter, like blood you can't spit out. I tasted it the morning the county inspector's truck rolled into my driveway. Rodriguez was his name, a man who'd probably joined the department to build a better world. Now he stood in front of me with his clipboard trembling, citing violations that didn't exist. Electrical hazards, septic mismanagement, environmental contamination, fabricated nonsense read from a script written somewhere above his pay grade. He couldn't meet my eyes. He just muttered, "Orders from the top, buddy. Sorry." Orders from the top. That meant Victoria's influence didn't end at HOA meetings or Facebook slander. She had her claws in county government. The machine wasn't just harassing me, it was weaponizing taxpayer dollars to grind me down, bleed me dry, force me out. And it worked, at least for a moment. I sat on the cabin's unfinished steps, holding the fresh citations, and wondered if I could actually survive this. But then I thought of Emma. Her face, red from crying, asking me if her father was dangerous. I thought of Silas muttering that land held secrets greater than men. And I thought of myself. What story would I allow to define me? That of the broken man who surrendered, or the one who stood against a machine designed to erase him? That's when it crystallized. This wasn't just about land. It wasn't about fines. It was about identity. About whether a man can be reduced to paperwork, fear, and lies, or whether he can resist, endure, and transform. And now I'm speaking directly to you, the one watching this. If you've been listening this far, you already know this story isn't just mine. It's about every man who has ever been cornered by power, every father who has had to fight for his name, every person who has felt the slow grind of a system trying to erase them. So here's what I want you to do. Drop this phrase in the comments. Twice, not once. Twice. Write, I remain unbroken. Because that's what this fight is about. Not property lines, not HOA covenants. It's about refusing to let anyone rewrite who you are. Victoria thought she could erase me, but what she never understood is that storms don't just destroy. Sometimes they carve mountains into sharper peaks. The counterpunch began quietly, almost invisibly, like the first rumble beneath an avalanche. I filed a single complaint with the state auditor's office, just one. But I didn't stop there. I sent copies of the HOA's financial summaries to the county paper, the regional news station, even a podcaster known for digging into small-town corruption. I didn't beg them to act. I just handed them the matches and let the gasoline-soaked truth speak for itself. Within days, Pine Valley wasn't quiet anymore. Reporters drove up the mountain. Strangers parked near the HOA office, snapping photos of locked doors and no comment signs. Victoria's empire, once built on whispers and intimidation, was suddenly dragged under a spotlight hotter than any courtroom bulb, and she hated it. She tried everything. Anonymous mailers painted me as a criminal, a fraud, even a child abuser. A sheriff's deputy randomly pulled me over 3 times in 1 week. My bank received suspicious calls suggesting I was laundering money. But instead of breaking me, each attack exposed how far she was willing to fall. To the outside world, she didn't look powerful anymore. She looked desperate. The real crack came from within her ranks. One of her own neighbors, an old man named Glenn, slipped me a folder late one evening. His hands shook as he passed it over. "She's been bleeding us for years," he whispered. Inside were invoices, private emails, and receipts showing Victoria's personal accounts fattened with HOA money. Not mismanagement, theft, pure and simple. That folder was dynamite. Sarah, my attorney, nearly laughed when she saw it. "This isn't just civil fraud," she said. "This is criminal, embezzlement, wire fraud, tax evasion. She's going to prison if this sticks." And that's when the war shifted. For months, Victoria had painted me as the intruder, the enemy, the man to be destroyed. But now, the valley saw her for what she really was, a parasite feeding on her neighbors, and parasites can't survive once exposed. As I stood outside my half-built cabin, I finally understood Silas's words. Land does hold secrets, but so do people. Some are buried deep, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig them up. I dug, I endured, and when the storm passed, I remained standing, unbroken. Victoria's world was unraveling faster than she could script it. News crews prowled the edges of her meticulously landscaped empire, capturing footage of HOA board members fleeing cameras, contracts shredded, files missing. Panic replaced her usual poise. Every lie she had built on fear was dissolving under the bright, unforgiving light of truth. She called emergency meetings, summoned attorneys, even threatened lawsuits against reporters, but the paper trail was concrete. Emails, receipts, and bank statements could not be misread or misplaced. Her empire of intimidation was crumbling while I stood quietly on my own land, listening to the wind whisper through pines and the distant cries of hawks. It was the soundtrack of vindication. The final blow, however, was psychological. With all her schemes laid bare, neighbors approached me, not with fear but with gratitude and apology. They confessed to signing false statements under duress, to fearing the fines, the citations, the invisible hand of Victi, Victoria's wrath. Their admissions weren't just legal ammunition, they were the human proof that her power had always been built on manipulation, not legitimacy. I realized then that winning this fight wasn't just about reclaiming my land, it was about reclaiming the narrative. Victoria had tried to define me, to brand me, to bend reality around her convenience. But the story of this valley, of this land, was mine as much as hers, or more so. For every lie she spread, I had evidence. For every threat, I had resilience. And for every attack, I had the patience to let her mistakes amplify themselves. By the end of that week, she had begun to retreat. Legal threats became whispers. Smear campaigns faltered. The county inspectors hesitated, no longer willing to bend under the weight of her influence. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her control, so absolute just days ago, now hung by threads she could no longer repair. And in that silence, in the calm after chaos, I understood a deeper truth. Power, like water, can't be held forever by force alone. It can be contained temporarily, but it eventually finds the cracks, the weaknesses, the channels you never expected. Victoria had built walls around herself, but her own greed, her own arrogance, and her own underestimation of me created the floodgates. I walked the edge of my lake, fingers brushing the docks my uncle had owned, the water calm beneath a setting sun. Victory wasn't loud, it wasn't the collapse of a building or a dramatic arrest. It was subtle, it was quiet, it was absolute. The aftermath wasn't a celebration. There were no champagne toasts, no banners, no parades down the mountain road. What I inherited wasn't just land, but perspective, the understanding that power and control are illusions unless backed by integrity. Victoria had gambled on fear, lies, and influence I had countered with patience, evidence, and relentless resolve. And in the end, reality always sides with truth. Neighbors, once wary and obedient, began returning to their lives without the shadow of intimidation. Apologies were whispered, stories were corrected, reputations quietly restored. And I watched, detached yet profoundly moved, as the web of deceit Victoria had spun slowly unraveled. Her empire of intimidation had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. She could scream, plead, or threaten, but her credibility was gone. I stood on the docks that I controlled, structures the HOA had no claim over, and let my mind wander. This wasn't just about property or HOA battles, it was a lesson in resilience, in recognizing when the world presses against you, and understanding that surrender is not inevitable. Sometimes, the smallest truths, paperwork, ledgers, a single video, carry more weight than armies of intimidation. Emma visited that weekend. She ran across the gravel, her laughter bouncing off the pines, the sound of freedom itself. We walked the perimeter of the property, and for the first time in months, there was no tension in the air. Just the lake, the cabin, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from surviving an ordeal designed to break you. I told her the story in fragments, careful to spare her innocence, but leaving no doubt. Her father had stood, had fought, had refused to be erased. And in that moment, I understood Silas's true legacy. The land held secrets, yes, but more importantly, it held lessons. Lessons about human weakness and strength, about the fragility of false power, and the durability of patience and resolve. Victory wasn't loud. It was methodical, deliberate, and unwavering. Victoria Ashworth eventually faded from the valley, a cautionary ghost for those who seek control through fear. Her name remained, but her authority evaporated like morning mist. And I, Marcus Brennan, the man who inherited more than just land, understood something vital. Real power doesn't demand obedience, it earns respect, and it survives storms by standing firm. I looked across the lake at the hoary, Zon, the sun setting behind distant peaks. For the first time in years, the future felt mine to shape, and the quiet truth settled deep in my bones. No storm, no threat, no system of fear could ever define me again.